how we're
Oh,
already
you
live. Is that what you're
you
talking about?
already hit
Yeah.
it. You go, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of the 60-day novel challenge with your honorable hosts, Hank Garner, Josh
Honorable
Hayes,
and
and myself.
distinguished.
Yeah, I
Honorable.
had to come up with a new synonym in my head. Yes, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're excited that you can be here for this live event. We are, what by my clock, 10 hours away from November 1st, which, 11 hours depending on where you are, maybe more, maybe less. Hi TW, hi Steph. So we are less than a day away from starting the actual writing portion of this novel writing challenge. The very,
Yes, we
very
are.
exciting part. Scary, intimidating, exciting, nerve-wracking, overwhelming. That's okay, because you've put in so much work over the last 4 weeks that you are prepared. You are more prepared than I think a lot of people, especially first-time authors, are when they tackle their first book. So, as prepared as you can be. How about we go with that?
Happy Halloween, TW. Happy Samhain, Steph.
I should have worn my Halloween costume on the show.
Should have.
I didn't think about that.
I'm dressed as Hank with hair.
Ilsa, you're what?
I said I'm dressed as Hank with hair.
I love that.
Ooh,
I love that.
It's been
Ilsa,
20
hello,
years.
hello.
It's been 20 plus years since I had luscious hair like that, Doug.
Okay, so for this week's show,
Successfully broke Doug.
we are no longer assigning homework, because your homework going forward from here is
Your
writing.
novel.
Yes, you have 50,000 words of homework between now and November 30th. So that is your assigned homework as of now. What we'll be doing is using this time to talk about what's coming up in your story, discuss how we approach things. Specifically today, we will be discussing the first act and the opening of your book. We're also going to be talking about things like not burning out. Once we get into the writing, we'll talk about our own wins and hurdles and successes and obstacles and all of that. And we'd like to hear from you about all of those as well as we progress through this. What's been exciting? What's been difficult? Where are you struggling? We're going to dedicate more time in these shows to Q&A sessions at the end. Odds are we won't have a very lengthy one today, because the writing, again, doesn't start until tomorrow, but anticipate that being a larger chunk, I'd say, going forward. But yeah, that is my opening spiel. I see that Thura is here. Happy Halloween. Jody Lee, good morning. Well, good afternoon for me, but good morning to wherever you're from. Yeah, Hank, Josh, how have you been? How's the last week been? How do you feel about your outlines and your characters and getting ready to jump into this writing process?
For me, since I completely rebooted my project about a week and a half ago, I have furiously been working on my outline and my plot grid. And I'm feeling really good about it. Like where I'm sitting right now, I'm feeling really good. I've got a 30 chapter outline. I have a prologue that I've already written. And I've got space for an epilogue that I'm toying with if that's going to be a thing or not. But I've left a space there in case I want to leave a little mystery at the end, and maybe some potential for another book. I don't know. It's going to depend on how this goes, but I've got a really good idea of what's going on. I even in my plot grid, I made a column for kind of the tone of each chapter that I'm working for. I've got my book is basically a story with two characters, and they're in a vehicle together in a truck, and they're going down a highway, and it's this conversation between the two of them with lots of flashbacks. And so I've kind of gone through and tracked out the emotional journey of the story. I kind of went to that detail, and I don't know if that's beneficial or not, but for me, just thinking about the story and thinking about the ebbs and flows and the high points and where I need to bring in some emotional impact or maybe some moments of levity and that sort of thing, it was very beneficial for me to kind of work through that exercise.
That's awesome. Now, Josh, before I bug you for the same thing, Hank, question for you.
Yes.
How did it feel realizing, hey, I don't want to write this story that I've been working on for a couple weeks? let's come up with this new or flesh out this new premise that I've had burning in my mind?
Very liberating, actually.
Good. Okay.
Because I still care about the story that I wanted to write. I still think it's a good idea, and I think that I can do some things with it that subvert some genre expectations. I don't know. It's just it's something that I want to do, more of a challenge for myself to see if I can fit in some places that I wouldn't normally fit in, so to speak. And so anyway, that's when I kind of finally realized that when I would wake up in the morning, I would be thinking about a story, and it was not the story that I had committed to. And I realized, well, why am I going to do this to myself? If there's something that's on my mind, at the front of my mind, that a story that I really want to tell, why am I just not pursuing that? So kind of when I took that decision and said, well, this is what I'm going to do, it felt like a weight had been lifted off, to really overuse a metaphor. But it was. So then when I sat down and Jane said, curious how long it took Hank to outline the new story, a couple of days, because I had an idea that I'd kind of been stewing on. It's a story idea that I started working on and writing Sprint Wednesdays, and I joked with Doug that the only time I ever think about this story is writing Sprint Wednesdays. It was just kind of this thing that I didn't have any expectations for, but I was just kind of holding on to, and it was a fun thing. And then the more I got to thinking about it, I was like, well, I see all kinds of potential here. And it really, I sketched out kind of the tent poles of the story really quickly. And then I said, well, since we're going to do a 30-day challenge, let's start with a 30 chapter outline. So that fits easily within the challenge, gives me something to shoot for every day, roughly, a chapter a day. And it really came together very quickly. And then as I started outlining, I came up with more and more ideas and some depth to the characters and some twists and turns and things that I hadn't thought about, because I'd never thought that deeply about it. But a couple of days really is all it took to really. And then over the last week, I probably spent 30 to 45 minutes a day just really thinking about it and working on the plot grid and thinking, like I said earlier, kind of the structural ebbs and flows of story. And I've just kind of dedicated that much to it, but it really came together pretty quickly.
Awesome. Now, I do just want to point out, for anyone astounded by Hank doing this in a few days, I've been, bugging him for like a dozen things over the last few days. He's like, Doug, I can't work right now. I'm planning my story. No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing, as I do anytime I speak in the presence of Hank.
And the whole time he's just
just gonna let that fly by.
Josh, since you're taking a drink, what about you? How's your outline coming?
It's coming along really well. Actually, I took some of the thoughts that we had used or that came up in last week's show when we were talking about POV and how to use them in your writing. I took a lot of that and looked at the outline that I had already done, and then seeded in some different things from alternative POVs just to see how the novel kind of looked from that direction. And I'm trying to have a kind of it's not really a two twist, but I'm having a turn, like two turns in the middle, where we see they originally kind of think that it's the local gangs that are kind of involved in what's happening, and then the first turn is figuring out that it's not gangs, it's North Korean spies. And then the second turn is seeing that the North Korean spies aren't really interested in the mine. They're trying to get this guy back to North Korea. So I've been playing around with, like, how do I set that up, and how do I add some alternative POVs in there without giving the second turn away. And I think what I've come up with is I'm going to have one or two or three short sequences where we see it from the North Koreans' perspective, but they're not talking about who the target is. They're just talking about the target, and the mission objective, and using some kind of uh, ambiguous terms in relation to what they're trying to do, so that I can kind of push the reader away from thinking it's this one person. And it's not going to be super difficult in those terms, just because even the characters in the book don't know, and so there's not going to be any kind of weird the reader knows something that the character doesn't know. But I want to be able to show the antagonist point of view without giving away the farm, as it were.
Mhm.
And so I've been kind of playing around with that a little bit and adding different things here and there. Looking at, I know how I write, and I know that I typically write long. And so trying to pare the outline down to below what I need, like from a number standpoint. I know last week we talked about, 100,000 words and 50 chapters and the 2,000 word kind of average, but I know that I'm going to go over that. So I don't need 50 chapters. I'll probably end up needing like 45 or something like that. And so just kind of going through and looking at what I already have outlined, where can I put things in that makes sense, and kind of get a little bit of flavor to the story without giving things away, and also being able to continually build the mystery, and like raising the stakes incrementally, while still maintaining the kind of intrigue and mystery of the story until we get to the point where everything blows up and then we're just charging through to the end. And so I've been playing around with that a lot, just trying to narrow down the major turns. One of the things that I've learned over my career as an outliner is that many times I'll get into the story and the original outline doesn't work. And so I where I used to do like really detailed, 15,000 word outlines. Now my outlines are usually 9 or 10,000 words, but they're extremely broad in scope. I just want to make sure that I have the bones of the story, so that I know like this is a twist that has to happen and it makes sense for everything else. And then I'll build around that as I start the writing.
Yeah. There are a couple things I want to latch onto from what you just explained, but one of the things first and foremost is I often will say on these shows, either this one or when Hank and I have our fireside chats, like, hey, pantsers, try outlining a little bit more. Like, it's usually a one-way street for me, especially for a challenge like this. The more you outline, and that's why we emphasize it so much, the more you have to fall back on when your motivation's waning or when writer's block pops up. Like, it's a tough challenge, right? But I also want to emphasize that people who are hardcore planners or plotters, try giving yourself a little bit more slack as well. Like, embrace that bit of discovery that comes within the boundaries that you've set for yourself. Because I know some people can be almost afraid of that, especially if they've invested 10, 15,000 words into an outline. You don't
Yeah.
want to deviate from that. But that's, sunk cost fallacy. Right? That's a wrong way of thinking, if I can be so bold. So give yourself a little bit of that slack.
Agreed. 100%.
And the other thing I wanted to mention is both of you have mentioned different styles of approaching chapters. Hank, you're doing 30 chapters for 30 days. Josh, you're doing 100,000 words in total. So you're aiming for, you're going to be more than 2,000 words per chapter. So like 40, 45 chapters maybe. I tend to write 3,500, 4,000 word chapters. And I know a lot of authors and newer authors ask how many words should be in a chapter. So what made you guys kind of land on those numbers?
Well, for me, I strictly thought in terms of a 30-day challenge, and I thought 30 chapters would be a round way to do that. I also fully expect to, I think I can probably land this in 50,000 words ish for a first draft, and then go back and do what our friend Steve Bowyer talks about, onioning a chapter. Go back through and read through a chapter and add layers of depth and kind of blow it up that way. And I kind of expect some of the chapters to accomplish the task, but not in a fully realized way. So I fully expect that a second draft will go through and expand that from roughly 50,000 words, maybe 60,000 words, out to 85, 90,000 words, probably is what I'm thinking. And I reserve the right to expand, although my 30 chapter outline accomplishes what it set out to with specific points that need to be hit. But you never know. And in the writing, there may come a point where I see that another flashback scene needs to happen to accomplish this thing, or maybe I'm being too one-sided with one of the characters and I need to add some more historical depth for the other one to kind of counteract what I'm doing with the other character. So I reserve the right to drop in a chapter here if I need to, but that's just how I'm thinking about it. And it's a little different this time because I'm specifically going for a target goal of 1 month. This is I on purpose did it this way because of the form that we're in. And honestly, now that I think about it, I don't know that I'd do much different any other time, but that's just how I'm thinking about it this time.
What about you, Josh? How'd you get to that 2,000 plus number?
I try to keep there's a kind of a speed algorithm is not the right word, but there's a way that people read fast-paced books. And like you're saying, 3,000, 3,500 word chapters, those for the genre that you're writing in, that hits that space. And for a faster paced kind of thriller book, in terms of white space on the page, you want to be able to make the reader think that they're going faster than they are.
Right.
And so if you have a 100,000 word book and there's 12 chapters, the reader reading that is going to feel like they're reading very slowly.
Yeah.
If there's no breaks in those chapters. If there's 50 chapters and they're going through 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 a day, they're going to feel like the book is reading much faster than it was just a giant wall of text.
Yeah.
But also I use chapters to build intrigue, to push them forward. In other words, if I had a sequence that in my outline is going to run, let's just say 4 chapters. If I put that all into one chapter, the reader feels like it's just a complete slog through those 4 chapters. But if I can break that huge sequence into scenes or chapters and leave a hook or some kind of a push at the end of one chapter, it almost forces them to keep reading to answer that question. But if you're reading a big block of text, sometimes you'll miss that context of, if I keep reading, they're going to answer this, or if I keep reading, this is going to happen. And so I look at it just in terms of speed and white space. 2,000 words is a really good average. It also, you can get to the midpoint in a scene, and maybe that midpoint is where your character gets hit in the face and you think they're going to lose, but then they come back and win. If you're just reading a really long block of text about that, you're not going to feel as anxious to turn the page and keep reading, because it just keeps going. But if he gets hit in the face and gets knocked out and the chapter ends, you're like, I need to know what happened, and you turn the page and you keep reading the chapter, rather than just just going down the page. So I really, really try to keep the end of the chapters hooked and pushed to the next one. And so sometimes, like I said, it's an average. Sometimes those chapters go for 1,000 words. Sometimes they go for 1,500. Sometimes they go for 2,500. It just really depends on the pace and sequence of the scenes that I'm laying out, where those particular hook and pulls happen. And that's where I usually make the breaks at. And a lot of times it'll happen in POV swaps. if there's multiple POVs in a sequence that you want to put together. Sometimes it's good if the transition between POVs doesn't have a hook, then I just put a scene break and I keep going. But if there's a hook between the POVs, then that's where I use the end chapter, start the next chapter, new POV, and then I answer the push pull from the previous section. So I keep it loose, and I try to make it as intriguing from chapter to chapter as I can, just to keep the momentum going forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I just checked as you were answering that on the urban fantasy books that I co-authored, and that's a faster paced genre than dark fantasy, right? Or subgenre than dark fantasy. All of the scenes, some of the chapters were 3,000 words, but then they were multiple scenes within a chapter that were 12 to 1,800 words on average. So just faster paced, which is good. So
yeah, if you look at like a book like Game of Thrones, those chapters like 5,000 words a piece.
Yeah.
But the genre supports that because you're going much deeper into the character profile, if you want to call it that, of the point of view, because it's strictly from that character's point of view. And you get a lot more in those scenes, because some of those scenes are just having lunch, right? And so there's not a big push pull to get through the book, and it's obviously 300,000 word book, so they're expecting that kind of longer read. But like if you look at some of Stephen King's books, Stephen King's had some books where like one chapter is one word. And then you go to the next chapter. For him it's style, obviously, but there is a correlation to how long the chapters are and how fast your reader thinks they're getting through the book.
Yeah. Well, we've interviewed several folks that have co-authored with James Patterson, and Patterson has a rule for all of his co-authors is that chapters have to be shorter than 3 pages long every time. And it's to keep, like you said, to keep those pages turning. And the hope is that someone's laying in bed, going to read 3 or 4 pages before they go to sleep, and they get that hook, 3 pages. We've got to turn it and see what happens. Like they get that hook again. And the next thing you know, they're 2:00 in the morning and got to wake up in 3 hours to go to work.
Right.
That's the hook.
Yeah.
Well, it's also like the sense of progression too. Everybody, it's the kind of meme with how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time, or how do you run a marathon? It's one step at a time. But when you think about 26 miles, you're like, there's no way that I can do that. But if you think about it as 42 halves, and you're running one half at a time, or whatever the thing comes out to, if you're reading a 100,000 word, 200,000, 300,000 word book, but there's 100 chapters, you can tell yourself after you've read 15 chapters, I've made a big dent in this book. But if you've only read 2 chapters, you're like, I'm never going to finish this book.
Right.
Yeah. And Ilza has a question here, but before we get to that, I just want to say Steph is spot on saying that genre matters when it comes to the length of a chapter, for sure.
100%.
And on the opposite end, though, I've mentioned this to Hank a couple times in our shows, but Richard Kadri's Sandman Slim books, they're printed on, I don't even have anything to reference. Like this is your standard notepad size. They're like up to here, right? They're smaller and there's no chapter breaks in them. It's wherever there would be a scene or chapter break, there's just an extra line break and then it just keeps going. And so at first I'm like, this is wild, right? Why is this
psychotic?
Yeah. And then I'm like 200 pages in one afternoon. And I said, okay, this is why it's structured like this.
You just lose yourself and and it makes you feel a little unstable when you're reading it, which is kind of his purpose, I think.
It's interesting, actually. He doesn't do this in the first trilogy, but Joe Abercrombie has in the Age of Madness and in the standalones, he doesn't number his chapters. They just have names. And I didn't think about that until I was doing the second read through that I'm doing. And that's very weird. Even though the numbers mean nothing really in the grand scheme of things, it's very weird when you get to a break and you have a chapter title but no number, and you're like, what chapter I'm on? Like that, I don't know. But in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. The number of the chapter doesn't matter, but it's just a weird kind of mental thing where you're like,
it's the sense of progression that we've programmed ourselves to expect.
100%.
Yeah. And it just it, like you said, it means nothing, but
Right.
it's just one of those conventions that we
Mm-hmm.
hang on to.
And I don't want to dwell on this for too long because we have a lot to talk about, but I'm also listening to Nestlings by Nat Cassidy right now. It's a horror novel. And what they've done is they have a chapter, and then there's almost like sub chapters numbered within the chapters. And then
Oh,
there's
right.
interludes between the bigger chapters as well. It was a little
It gives
strange
me the
at
ick.
first,
Yeah.
but it's done intentionally, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
perspective swapping and a lot of different, like some scenes are only dialogue and there's no actual, prose or exposition in between them. It's interesting. It's a very cool take on it. I'm enjoying the story, so it's
So
working.
does he have
King did
multiple
that a lot. King did
Yeah.
that a lot, where he
Yeah.
had chapters and then little numbers. The Gunslingers like that. The whole
Yeah.
Dark
I
Tower
forgot
series
about
is
that.
like that.
Right.
So that book that you're reading, Doug, does he change perspective within the same chapter? Is that why he has the sub chapters?
Yeah.
So
Which
he
I would just
breaks
do
the
with the scene
golden
break.
rule of head hopping.
Well, that's the thing though. There's a break in between it, so
Yeah.
it works. And I've
Interesting.
changed perspectives within the same chapter, but I've used a little scene break. I have like wings on mine because angels, right? Or you have like your 3 asterisks or like a pound or whatever.
Yeah.
Hank, it's stylistic, okay? It looks really cool. You'd know if you ever bought my book, Hank.
Or if had any style when he wrote.
Touche. Touche.
And then Steph asking here, how do they have it set up to have chapters within chapters? The planning behind it, I'm not sure, and I'm still trying to figure out the rhythm to the chapter setup, because that's eluding me a little bit. And I'm cursed with this, not just a writing and editing brain, but someone who gets to do these cool live shows, so I have to think about it. Like, I think about these things subconsciously. Are you grabbing the Dark Tower there, Josh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the way that he did it in the Dark Tower was kind of a take on what I'm talking about, where you're pushing the reader forward. It's almost like like you have chapter 1, the Gunslinger 1, and then you have a section, and then it goes 2, and then you have a section. Those are almost section breaks, where
Yeah.
the number is just arbitrary. It's just a section
Yep.
break. So if you have a chapter where you're writing chapter 1, you have a scene, section break, scene. Just imagine taking that section break out and putting a number there, and
Number it.
it doesn't mean anything. It's just the section or the time break or whatever it is. That's just how he chose to write it. It does get kind of confusing. Like when you're listening on audio, it'll go like part 1, chapter 1, this 1, and you're like, what's going on?
Get to the story.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Anyway, that's
Okay.
my special edition illustrated The Gunslinger.
Very cool. Okay, we're gonna dive into a little bit more about the first act now, and I love the questions coming in. Keep those coming, because these are going to be a bit more of a discussion-based thing. Actually, before we go into the first act, I am gonna bug Hank. I asked him if he could share his plot grid. You might have seen it pop up once or twice there.
Yeah.
While
Sorry
he's
about
doing
that.
I do encourage everyone in the chat here to tell us, what are you going to be writing tomorrow? Just give us a quick summary of what your story is, because I love seeing these things. I see a lot of them in the Swordcraft Cafe community, and I'm getting excited for a lot of people, but feel free to share here too. So Hank, go ahead, share away.
So my plot grid, like I said, is 30 chapters plus. I've got a prologue that I've already written, and then I'm holding a spot for an epilogue that I don't know that I'm going to use that, but and since my book is mostly 2 perspectives, but those 2 perspectives are almost always on screen, then I have I've got the scene. I've kind of given it an arbitrary title, and then I've got 5 story beats that I generated for each chapter, and then I've got kind of a summary of what each chapter is going to accomplish, and then some notes from Buddy's perspective, which is one of the characters, and then from Caleb's perspective, the other character. And then I mentioned that I added this column with kind of tone and what I was kind of shooting for in that chapter. I don't know that that's really worth anything, but it was just an experiment I'm playing with. And so each chapter, I can click through, see the beats that I envision happening, and then what those beats mean from each character's perspective, and that's
Very cool.
how I'm doing it.
Yeah, I like that. And see, the plot grid is so versatile in that
Yeah.
way.
I can show you
Now-
mine if you want. It looks really
Yeah.
dirty, but you can
And-
see mine if you want.
And if this was a different
I'll add
kind
it
of
to the
book
green
where
room.
I had characters coming in and you know where you change perspectives, then it would look very different. But since I have two main characters and they're pretty much on stage together all of the time with some flashbacks happening, that's why mine kind of looks like you know, there's not a lot of staggered
Mhm.
like Josh has in his that I can see in the preview there. That
Oh, we have to add that for you, don't we?
Yeah,
sorry.
I don't think I can
Alt
do it
power.
myself.
There you go.
Try
Mine's
that.
not as cool as everybody else's, but I do the chapters in the scene column, and then I just have all of the scenes that I'm going to put in each chapter where I think they go, and then in those scenes is where I have the rough outline. I have some of these tagged for POVs, but then I have a whole bunch of stuff down here that I don't know exactly where it's going to go yet. And like I said, I keep it very, very loose. And so I've got all the way to where the turn happens, which is be 6 or 7. And then the rest of the chapters, I don't typically add until I get to the point where I know I'm going to be writing them. And then I'll add them in and adjust where the cards go. So that I can get everything situated without having to reorder a whole bunch of stuff.
Very cool. Awesome.
Fun.
I took it off for you.
Okay, cool.
'Cause I'm kind like that. But yes, that's like there are 3 different people on stage here, 3 different ways that we've used the plot grid.
Yeah.
Very different styles. And I'm sure, you know, we have almost 20 people here watching right now, probably another 20 different ways to use the plot grid. So that's cool. Awesome. And see, TW, loving the plot grids. Very cool. Someone agrees with me. Hank usually doesn't.
Literally,
Anyway.
in my job description, it's antagonist to Doug. That's one of the bullet points.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, you
Uh,
misspelled antagonist. Actually, it's Chief Dabble antagonist.
Well, you know.
Okay, so now we are going to move into what we're here to talk about, the first act, because that's what we're embarking on tomorrow when we start writing. So I'm going to turn back to you two, and
It's been
I'm
a
going
very
to
long prologue to this chapter.
yeah.
It's like an epic fantasy prologue.
Yeah.
Right.
But it has been very helpful, and I think it's been a very
Yeah.
good conversation so far, which is why
Absolutely.
I haven't cut you kids off. So when it comes to the first act or starting your story, in the template we suggested, you know, 3 different ways you can think about starting your story, and that's generally in the opening scene, focusing on setting, character, or some kind of action. Those aren't the only 3 ways, but they're a decent way to get yourself started. But I want to know from you two, how do you go about thinking about the opening scene, writing the opening scene? How often do you revisit it? What does it look like? What happens? Josh, we'll start with you.
For me, I think there is a misconception in I think the majority of the writing community when they talk about beginnings, because everybody says start the beginning with action, and I feel like that's not correct, because everybody assumes that to be an explosion or something, right? I start from the standpoint of starting with intrigue, not action, because I don't want to throw the reader into a situation where maybe there's a gun battle happening, but the reader's not going to care about the gun battle. They don't know who the characters are. They're not going to care about this anything because they don't know the stakes. They don't know who the characters are. They don't know who, like, anything like that. So I try to start with intrigue, and what I'm doing is I'm kind of starting in media res almost, where the team is in a car driving to raid a safe house, and I'm using that sequence to, one, introduce the characters, but also set up the stakes of the scene, so that when they do get into the inevitable gun battle that happens in the beginning, we care a little bit about them, and that kind of goes to the there was I think it was in the notes Hank sent me about establishing the ordinary, I think.
Mhm.
So the ordinary for them is doing these kind of things. That is ordinary for them. And so starting with the kind of preamble to the raid instead of going right into kicking a door. And it's not very long either. You know, we have maybe 2,000 words of them riding in a car, talking about what's going on and what they're going to do. But there's also not a lot of beginning exposition to explain really what they're doing or who they are. Like I'm going to have some of the dialogue establish relationship connections where they're going to be maybe telling an inside joke or one of the things I have is one of the characters is going to comment that he doesn't usually let anybody drive his car because this character he's kind of like an exec at the mine and he gets paid a lot of money, and so he has like a really nice Yukon Denali, like super nice, decked out, like nice rims, leather interior and all that. And he's really anxious because this team member, not him, is driving the car. And Cooper, the main character, is going to say something along the lines of, trust me, if we get into the shit, you're going to want her driving because she's the best driver that we have and she can drive the wheels off of anything. And that takes I don't have to have any exposition to explain why she's a good driver or how she's a good driver or how it makes sense. I just have that as a 1-sentence throwaway so that later on in the story, when she's driving the wheels off of something, we already know, it's already established that she is a really good driver. And I don't have to like tell that. I don't have to show that beforehand. We already just expect it. And there's a lot of things that you can do with that kind of setup where it can be kind of a throwaway introduction to something, and it's foreshadowing without the reader seeing the foreshadowing. So that's how I start. I kind of look at, see where is the best place to start. And in terms of this story, I could have started with, and I originally had the main character somewhere else, and he gets a call from his buddy and he's got to take the plane ride down there and all of that. And I thought that all that's kind of boring. We don't need to know any of that. We can just start with what they're going to do once they get down there and build everything else out from that. Because this scene with the safe house raid really, one, it sets the tone for the story that I'm trying to tell, and two, it establishes at least one of the turns that happens at the midpoint of the story, and also introduces the characters in an interesting way that we're not getting like bio readouts of, oh, you went to high school in 1972 and went to college and all that. I don't need any of that. All that stuff is great color and I can use it later, but I don't need it to pull the reader in to be interested in the story. So I usually just look at the opening scenes as an opportunity to build intrigue and tell the reader, give the reader just kind of a little flavor of what they can expect through the rest of the book without really trying to bog them down in a whole bunch of other logistical things that I know need to happen in the story, but don't need to be at the beginning.
There's one of the things I really want to latch on to about what you said there is focusing on that ordinary world idea, because it is something that we bring up in the template. It is something that you'll hear in a lot of writing advice everywhere. But I want to emphasize for people that ordinary doesn't mean boring, right?
Yeah.
Like ordinary means going on this high stakes mission in a different country. Ordinary could
Right.
mean scavenging for supplies in a post-apocalyptic world. It could
100%.
also mean going to your day job where you're going to get fired and that's your inciting
It's
incident or something.
ordinary to the character's story
Yes.
that you're telling. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's a
Exactly.
necromancer, he could be like sucking the soul out of some person, and that's ordinary for him.
Just another Monday. So
Yeah,
Right.
it's
Right.
that's Hank's Tuesday afternoon.
yeah. The idea is to find that ordinary so that when you have that inciting incident, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit, we know that, hey, this is something disruptive and this is something big that they can't really ignore, right? But Hank, what about yours? I see Blackblade is saying that the opening scene has been keeping them up at night. So Hank, I'm interested to hear about how you approach the opening scene, so maybe we can provide some clarity.
The opening scene for me is almost never about opening with action, like Josh was talking about. But for me, it's almost always about opening with a question or something that shows the typical world, the normal world for the character, but almost always shows them off balance a little bit. For instance, in the book that I'm writing for the challenge, I had I had this one little passage that just kept coming up to me, and that's how I knew that I wanted to write this was that this guy is driving on a lonely, dark highway one night, picks up a hitchhiker, and they start talking, and the hitchhiker says, "My name is Buddy Deadweiler, or at least it was before the last time I died." And I was like, "Whoa, what's that about?" And so immediately, that doesn't necessarily bring you to an inciting incident. That's still to come, but it's something that kind of puts the reader off balance a little bit. And I love starting with something like that. And then in my book Writer's Block that I wrote a few years ago, I had this idea of a writer that was a very successful novelist that was trying to finish a trilogy that everyone's waiting for. He couldn't figure out how to do it. Um, and he has writer's block. And so he gets an old typewriter from a garage sale and thinks that he's going to try something different to change the scenery of his writing. And this, whatever he types on this typewriter starts coming true. The next day. So he writes just nonsense stories. And then the next day, they're the headlines of the paper. And then what happens from there? So I start thinking in a glimpse into the normal world, but a little off kilter. And then when I think of that opening scene, I almost always know how the novel is going to end. I almost never start writing until I really have a vision for that final scene and really a vision for that final paragraph. Like I almost always know exactly how it's going to land. Now things change in the middle sometimes of how you get there, but I've never started writing something that I didn't know exactly how it was going to end. Some wording may change, but the emotional impact is always exactly what I envisioned from the beginning. So that's how I approach it.
When I was just
Right.
thinking about Black Blade's question, kind of comment there while Hank was talking, and I definitely I've been there where I'm trying to figure out like how do I open this and explain the stakes and explain the story and get people interested. And the best thing that I can think of to make it less overwhelming is uh, that opening doesn't have to set up the question for the story. It can just set up a question that leads to the question of the story.
Mhm.
In other words, if you're trying, if your story is a highway and you have a destination at the end of that highway, the question could be getting on the on ramp onto the highway. It doesn't
Hmm.
have to automatically point you to that highway. When you're introducing the character, you're not introducing everything about the character. You're just introducing a small glimpse of the character to give enough interest that people care about them and that they want to follow. The question might not even it could be important to the character, but it might not be important to the story that you're telling. And that I think sometimes gets lost because I think that's where a lot of people get kind of confused about the murky middle is they
Hmm.
use that beginning and they use that inciting incident to that's the entire question for their
Right.
story. And I think sometimes if you set up the beginning, even the inciting incident, but if you set up that question at the beginning, the question is interesting, but that question might not have anything to do with the actual story that you're telling.
Exactly.
That question just leads to the bigger question. And even
Yeah.
sometimes the inciting incident, like for my story in particular, my inciting incident is introducing the North Koreans into the plot where they think it's these local gangs, but it's not. And the inciting incident ramps it up where they're not, okay, now it's a state actor. What's actually happening here? But that's not the whole point of the story. You don't get that until the second turn. And so some of that thing, when you, as an author, you think of your story, and this is the story I'm trying to tell, and you want to get that in the first paragraph, and it's impossible to do that. So you
Mhm.
just break it down into really itty bitty chunks and go, what does the reader need to be intrigued about this? It's like, if you ever ask a question, can you tell me a little bit about your story? And 45 minutes later, the author has got like to the midpoint of their story, but they're the people that are listening are like glassed over. It's that one sentence tagline is all you need.
Yeah.
And if you can get that intrigue into those first couple of pages, it doesn't matter what question you're asking. It just has to be intriguing enough to make the reader keep reading to get to that actual question.
Tom Clancy was brilliant at that, of posing questions in the beginning, giving you a glimpse into the normal world, and usually the normal world was chaos. But
Yeah.
it was not the chaos that would be the ultimate big question of the novel. It's
Right.
little chaoses that
Yeah.
usually bring people into the big chaos, and he was
100%.
brilliant at doing that. You know.
Yeah. Now, Steph said, Hank, she really likes the way that you explained the opening scene, which is awesome. To mix things up a little bit, you've both mentioned, not necessarily diving into action in the opening scene. I tend to dive into action in the opening
you do.
scene, but I
Of
want
course he does. Of course he does.
I want to
Hank,
throw
you
in
have a
two
mute
caveats
button?
there.
Mute him,
Um,
Hank.
We can kick him
Uh,
off.
There we go. Oh, let's just keep
That's good. I want to throw in two caveats though. Caveat number one: action doesn't necessarily mean like a gunfight or a sword fight or a car chase. Action can mean a breakup, right? It is something dynamic, something with stakes, which is important based on what you said, Josh. Because if you're just throwing random action in there and the reader doesn't know the stakes, and the action is not useful, which is why
100%.
I also tend to use action as a tool to introduce either the setting or the character. And in my case, with my opening scene, I have my main character showing up on Earth for the first time during the literal apocalypse, and there will be action. There will be sword fights. Don't get me wrong, but those sword fights are used to show, hey, there are monsters everywhere, and used to show her discomfort or her anxiety at being isolated from the people she's supposed to be there with. Right. So if you're using action, make it have a purpose in your opening story. If you
100%.
if I were to throw in just a fight with a monster and then that's never referenced again, or it doesn't lead to anything, that's a bad opening scene.
Yeah.
Awesome.
There's I'm trying to think of a book that I know where I've read where it starts a fight with a demon. I think it's Larry Correa's Saga of the Forgotten Warrior, and I can't remember what it's called now, but he starts with that aspect. But the character's a demon hunter, and that's his ordinary, right? And so it makes sense in the context of the story that he's telling that he opens up with fighting a demon, because even though you don't care about the characters per se, it's an intriguing enough sequence where you're learning about the character and how his thought process is and what he's doing, that it's like, oh, this is really interesting. It's a demon hunter. I don't care that he dies, but I'm really interested in how he's dealing with this situation, and then it progresses from there. So there are instances where you can start with an explosion or a gunfight.
Peter Brett's The Demon Wars saga, I think.
The Painted Man. Yeah.
He kind of opens that way too. And
yeah.
Yeah.
There's actually a really interesting section in that book where he fights a demon for the first time and cuts his hand off, and then that demon follows him around like for the whole book. That book was it went off in a different direction. I didn't think it was a great
bonkers.
I liked the first three. The other, it was okay.
Yeah.
But my Strikers War book, I actually started with a gunfight, and like the antithesis of everything that I'm talking about. I started with a gunfight, but I used that gunfight to display that the main character was a really, really, really good shot, and he went off to sniper school after that because of what he did in that mission. It wasn't anything about the actual gunfight that happened. It was just the thing that I needed to show that he was a really, really good shot. And then it's like that movie Jarhead. Have you guys ever seen that? It's Desert Storm movie,
Mhm.
and the guy's a sniper, and he never gets to take the shot. And that's what I kind of did in this book, is that I played him up to be this really good shot, and then he never got to take the shot. And it was that's kind of a trope in mil sci-fi, because that stuff happens in the military. But as I go on this rambling tangent, I was like, wait a minute, I did start in a gunfight instructor school.
Okay, so that's the opening that we're talking about, and we touched on establishing the ordinary there, and I think sufficiently enough. Is there anything either of you want to add about establishing that ordinary?
Just we've said it kind of. Just don't. The ordinary is ordinary to the character, but also don't make the ordinary boring. Make the ordinary interesting.
Yeah.
Because if the I've heard so many people say, "Oh, the book is good at like the 50% mark. You just got to get through all the rest of the stuff." Or they read a series and they're like, the first book's kind of so-so, but the second book is where it really takes off. If you're looking at your story and going, it's really boring for the first 10,000 words, and then it kicks off, see if you can take out those 10,000 words. If you can take out those 10,000 words and start where it's interesting, then do that. If you can condense those 10,000 words into 2, and they do the same work as the 10,000, then try to start there. I think a lot of people try to start too early in their story to give backstory or to give context to the setting. In sci-fi and fantasy, it's a little different because there is so much kind of world building that you have to do. But you don't have to introduce everything about your character in the first couple of pages. If they're some kind of really smart professor, you don't have to give their whole CV about how they became a professor and their skills and all of that. You can have them do one thing, just figure out one problem or say one thing that shows the reader this guy is a really smart guy. And then you can kind of seed that stuff in later. But in my opinion, the beginning of the book shouldn't be like telling everything about the character. It's just showing, here's the character. Intro. That's all it is. Intro.
No. Wow, a voice crack. That's my second one on live stream this week. It's the worst. Hank, do you have anything to add before?
Look, hey, everybody goes through puberty at different times in their life, Doug. It's nothing to be ashamed about.
I'm moving us along anyway.
I didn't have to say it because I knew Josh would.
I was right there for you. I was right there for you.
So one of the ways that we can view the ordinary world then is to juxtapose it to the next big beat in this story, which is the inciting incident. And the premise of the inciting incident is that it catapults your character into the rest of the plot, but it also disrupts their ordinary world. And so sometimes when I've been planning a story, it's like, okay, here's what I want to have happen. What's the little bit before that I can sprinkle in to establish that ordinary? Because the inciting incident, in my opinion, is like what the first act is about. That's the part I'm most excited to write, right? That pushes us forward. So how do you guys go about planning for, thinking of, and writing the inciting incident then? Hank, you get to go first because Josh insulted me.
I don't put a whole lot of thought into it. It usually, if I have kind of established this question that I have in the beginning and I know how I'm going to land it, I just start thinking of ways to ramp the character into this place that he doesn't want to go. And I kind of think of it that way. I don't. I think of it in terms of like character reaction. This is where I need him to go. This is where he is. What can I do to make him uncomfortable and cram him into a place where he doesn't want to go? And it usually kind of starts around there.
That is, I think, a key element to it. There, like, for most stories, I think there should be some element of friction that stops the character from wanting to change. Their ordinary is comfortable, right? Even if it's not boring, it's what they're used to. So if something is pushing them away from that, they don't actually want that. I often think about like the Hobbit movies specifically, where Bilbo's like, no, I don't want to go be a burglar for you, Gandalf and dwarves, get out of my house. And then like runs to catch up to them, right? There's that reluctance, and then he decides that he's going to go on this quest. So that's how I usually, from a theoretical standpoint, think about the inciting incident. Maybe not necessarily always practical. But Josh, what about you?
It honestly, it kind of depends on the story that I'm writing at the time. For this novel that I'm working on now, there's one clear inciting incident where the thing becomes something that they didn't expect it to be, and that they weren't prepared for doing. They were just going down there to kind of help a buddy out with a local problem, and then it becomes an international level incident, and it raises the stakes of what they're doing, because not only can anyone not know they're down there, but also once these things start happening, there's no way to hide it, and so they've got to deal with that, and that ramps up the tension for the characters, but also for the readers. And it also takes it to another level where they're not just dealing with kind of local thugs; they're dealing with real trained uh, uh, enemy agents that are not that. I mean, they have technology and they have resources, and it's just a completely different mission now. With Weaponized, there are three separate character plot lines that kind of proceed. What's the right? Is it concurrently? They're right next to. They go like right along with each other. They don't.
Yes,
They don't
concurrently.
intersect until later on in the book. And so for Weaponized, there's actually three separate inciting incidents for each character. And I varied the length of ordinary or intro for each character thread. So like for instance, one character has 3 or 4 chapters before his inciting incident happens. Another character has 1 chapter before the inciting incident happens, and another character has 3. Um, but they're all different because they all of the thing that happens to them is different in their personal case. But in each instance, it changes their ordinary, and it dramatically affects the story they thought they were in, right? And I if I'm telling a multi POV story, which I am in Weaponized, where there's different plot threads that don't significantly line up until like halfway through the book, then I think about that process as 3 individual stories with 3 inciting incidents and 3 individual turns, and then try to line those up in a way that they happen relatively close to each other, and not in a way where they feel kind of detached and kind of just thrown out there. So it really kind of depends. Some stories start with the inciting incident and then roll from there, and the 10 or 15% inciting incident is actually more of a turn than the incident. It just honestly, for me, it depends on the kind of story that I'm telling. With Edge of Valor, the inciting incident happens before the book starts, and we don't really get that until the end of the book. We don't know why everything happened the way it did until the end of the book. With the second book, the inciting incident happened kind of right at the beginning, and the same thing with the third. With the first novel that I wrote, Terra Nova, the inciting incident was I don't know, 10 or 12 chapters in. And so again, it just really kind of depends on which on the story you're telling.
Hmm. Which is a good point there, where the inciting incident can kind of shift around a little bit, especially if you're embracing, rather than like the 3 act structure, you're looking at something like in medias res that you mentioned before,
Yeah.
where there is no ordinary world to establish, or there's very, very little. And that's, common, I think, like Gerard Butler films, or like
Oh, right.
a rom-com where it does start with the breakup. The breakup is the inciting incident, and everything that follows is in reaction to that.
Yeah.
So there are different options on how you can place your inciting incident. For me, because this is a shorter novel, my inciting incident is chapter 2. I'll use chapter 1 to establish that ordinary, and then chapter 2, I'm tying that inciting incident to my protagonist's biggest fear, right? Which is her being by herself, being isolated, and feeling lost. So that's when she like gets to Earth in the apocalypse, is isolated, but finds her folks, finds her legion, and then something happens and boom, they're split up again, but like for real this time. So that's her inciting incident and kicks off her internal conflict for me, which is what I really want to focus on beneath all of the spells and sword fights and explosions and fire. That's what I want to focus on.
A really interesting exercise or thought that I had was thinking about stories that really don't have a defined inciting incident, and if they do, it's not necessarily that. Like the story that I'm thinking about right now is Seven, the movie Seven with Morgan
Mhm.
Freeman and Brad Pitt. You could look at that story from a certain perspective and say that the inciting incident doesn't happen until John Doe shows up at the police station 3/4 of the way through the
Right.
movie, because all the rest of it is just a murder investigation, and we know that there's a serial killer out there. You could say that the inciting incident is them discovering the clues, but they were already working the case, and so looking at it from that perspective and saying, can you play around with that structure and 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 write a story where the inciting incident either happens maybe in the beginning, or because
Mhm.
the with Seven, the investigation is there almost the entire movie, but it doesn't really come to a point. Well, I guess you could call it a turn as well when John Doe shows up, but you didn't see that coming, and it definitely changed everything about the movie from that point
Right.
on.
Mhm.
So it's very interesting, the structure you can play with when you're working with story.
Yeah. Well,
My
and
inciting incident is going to happen at the end of chapter 1, which is pretty early in the novel, but because of the framing story, um, I've basically got two people stuck together, and everything
Mhm.
happens, in very close, POV. Um, it happens toward the beginning, and there's not a lot of setup. And that's one reason I thought of the prologue, which I'm usually not a big fan of a prologue, but this was kind of a time jump back, and it really shows um uh the the um the prologue is a glimpse back about 50 years when Buddy started on this journey that he's on, and right after he initially made the deal with the devil. And there's a traveling tent preacher that comes to town, and his wife gets religion and drags him to this service, and this sweaty evangelist that's whipping this crowd into a frenzy, notices Buddy over there sweating with the decision that he made, and he latches onto it, and Buddy just kind of melts down in his uh in him wrestling with his conscience, and runs out. And it's just something there to really to introduce that. You don't know initially why he feels this way, but you just know something's very, very wrong. And it was just a fun way to kind of launch into it.
Yeah, I love
you
that.
know, my gut instinct is to say that sounds really interesting, but then my Doug Hank antagonism instinct is to say there's a lot of sweating going
Yeah.
on in that prologue.
Well,
But you bring up something that I do want to touch on real quick
yeah.
before we get to the last little bit of our show. And that's prologues themselves, because I am so hypercritical of prologues. When
Yeah.
someone hires me as an editor and they have a prologue, I just kind of go at them, because if your prologue can be chapter 1, it's not a prologue anymore.
Yeah.
So by you having that time gap, that makes sense for it to be a prologue. But if you
Well,
want to include a
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
that's
off.
okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
If you want to include a prologue in your book, make it a different time, a different place, a different perspective, something that doesn't fit in with the actual story that you're telling in
Yeah.
the actual book itself, right?
Yeah.
And bear in mind, a lot of readers, like a sizable number of readers, will skip a prologue. So
Yeah.
it should be nice information, but it doesn't necessarily need to be mission critical information, because it might not get read.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you guys mentioned that, because I've been playing around with a prologue for mine, and the initial prologue I had in mind was a mission in Afghanistan like 5 years before, to kind of introduce the characters. And then I thought, man, I could do that, but I can also do it just through the story itself.
Mhm.
And then I have an idea to do a prologue where it's from the perspective of a sleeper agent who's going to college, and he sees the North Korean defector. That's the whole point of the book. The North Korean defector is a scientist, but he also teaches at this college, and the sleeper agent identifies him. And I don't show who he identifies in the prologue, but I end the prologue with him making a phone call. And it's obviously, him contacting his handlers to say, "Hey, I found this guy." And I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to use it or not. It's an interesting idea. It sets up a little bit of an intrigue, but I don't know if it's necessary. Like you said, if you're going to do a prologue, it's got to be interesting, and it's got to be something that you can't do in the rest of the book. And like you said, a lot of people skip them anyway, and you could easily just retitle the prologue as chapter 1, and it wouldn't affect anything other than the reader's feelings about it sometimes. So yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's just something I like prologues, typically speaking. If you want to talk about the king of prologues, like Sanderson has 3, right, in the Way of
Right.
Kings, and
And they're as long as some novels.
yeah, and you don't technically need them. You could start the Way
Yeah.
of Kings reading at book 1, but they do get a little bit of lore and a little bit of flavor to the book. And I don't know, you get. I think it's sci-fi and fantasy. You get a little bit of a handicap with that. You can do it, and the readers aren't going to really be that super critical about them just because they're expected in that kind of a situation.
We can't apply mere mortal laws to someone like Brandon Sanderson.
That's
right?
true.
Right.
I'll give you that.
He could literally
I'll give you
do
that.
anything at this point,
Yeah.
and it would
Yeah.
sell. So
See Spot Run, $1 million.
Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Okay. Initially we had actually no. Let's stick with it. We'll spend maybe 5 minutes on this one, and we'll revisit it next week. But once you start writing, there's like this burst of excitement, right? It's, hey, new story, gotta get into it, new characters. I want to explore this whole new world, kind of thing. And then eventually that momentum's gonna peter out. Now that usually happens more in the second act, but what's some early advice for people as they're starting out with this new novel? Like, what can they do almost proactively to try to keep that excitement or that momentum going?
I usually, like, I think I've said this before, but I don't usually have a problem with middles because I'm always trying to set up the next big thing. And most of my books have at least 2 turns before I get to the final climax. And I think a lot of authors try to push that turn to the climax. And the turn can be something completely separate from the climax, or it can be another inciting incident that pushes the characters towards the climax. But I typically try to map out the big turns and then reverse navigate the scenes that I need to set that up, but also try to look for things where I can put action in so that I'm always working towards an action scene. And that way I don't have a lot of like kind of navel gazing where they're sitting around having lunch and just talking about life. I do have those sequences in there, but I try to keep those as minimal as possible and always try to ramp up the tension to that next big point in the story. And so if you have 2 or 3 or 4 of those big sequences that happen in your book, building towards those really takes out a lot of the guesswork in the middle because you don't have to figure out what I'm doing to fill in the pages between those. And if you have a turn that happens before your climax that pushes them into that ending, you can work towards the turn and not the climax. Because in most, like, and I think Hank and you, Doug, are in this category too. We've already got the ending kind of figured out. We know what we want to do. And so, yeah, we're trying to get there because that's going to be the fun part of writing the book. But if you have something that instigates that climax that is also cool, working towards that and setting that up as well as possible really gives a lot of space to fill in all that stuff. And like I said at the beginning, when you're introing, if you keep that intro really small, it gives you a lot of I don't want to say filler because I don't want to say filler as bad, but if you have some backstory or something that you want to fill in, that you think is important to know about the character, those things can be kind of sprinkled in through that building process to the next turn, where you can spend 500 or 1,000 words of backstory on your way to this next point. If they've got to take a car ride from A to B, and B is the start of the sequence to get to your turn, then in that car ride, you can have. Do you remember that time when we were in this van and we were like, you can have that stuff in there, and that gives the good, the hill and trough kind of thing,
Yeah.
where you're going up and down with the rising and falling action. That gives you those backstory bits, or those like kind of character building moments that you want to have in there. You can sprinkle those through, and so that it gives you time and gives the reader time to relax before you get to that next intriguing or action part of the story, and it doesn't really drag really much. You can kind of sprinkle them in.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of, if you're going to have big moments of action or suspense or whatever, that you need moments of levity or a break, and allow the reader to recover, so that then when you bring that action sequence in, or that moment of tension, it's more um, uh, relevant. It hits harder because you've allowed their adrenaline to come down, and then give them some normal world, the typical day stuff, and then wham, hit them again, and then they have room to emotionally react.
Right.
Yeah, because that emotional reaction is like the action sequences are fun and exciting, but the whole point of them is for that emotional reaction that comes afterwards.
Right.
What does it mean to the character?
And
So
aren't we writers because we want to hold readers in the palm of our hand and manipulate their emotions? That's
well, I was going to say
that's
crush
why we
them,
do
but
what
yeah,
we-
that works
well,
too.
I mean,
A really good example for anybody interested in uh, pulling the audience through a story without boring them are James Cameron stories. And say what you want about his stories in general, but if you look at the structure of all of his movies, they all do the exact same thing. Aliens has a lot of action in the movie, but there are small sequences where there's no action and it's just the
Mhm.
characters talking. But even the scene where where Hicks is teaching Ripley how to use the gun, that's a trough sequence. That's a falling action sequence, and it's setting up what she does later. But it also is giving the audience a breather. Now we're not
Mhm.
getting chased by aliens, but it's still an interesting moment, because otherwise she wouldn't know how to use the gun at the end of the movie.
Right.
But in the context of that scene, it's really nothing. It's them having lunch and having a bologna sandwich and talking about things, but it's showing character and building towards that next action sequence that comes. He does that very well in all of his movies.
Agreed.
Well, now I'll just have to go watch Alien again, I guess.
Yes. Then
Uh,
I've twisted your arm.
I'm gonna diverge a little from the actual writing structure and craft, and say that for maintaining momentum and excitement, as a shameless plug, make sure you've joined the Storycraft Cafe and just tell us about what you're doing. Like, share your accomplishments. You wrote 1,600 words on a day. Okay, tell us about that. You're struggling with something. Tell us about that, and we can help you out with it. You only wrote 400 words. Only. That's still a win, right? Share
Yeah.
it, and like it's still progress. It's still success. So that's
100%.
wins are the best way to keep going.
Speaking of
I
the
was going to
cafe,
say
I
about
shared the prologue for my book in the share your work section in the cafe. If
Okay,
anyone's interested to go see how I
I'll go tear it apart.
started this, and yeah, keep your Canadian comments to yourself.
We do from the cafe. Sorry, before I get to that, Josh, you were going to mention something there.
I was going to say about the momentum of the story, but also the momentum of the writing. Um, uh, if you're doing the challenge, and obviously you're trying to hit that 50,000 words, and you get to a section of your story and you're struggling, and you get 400 words or 100 words, and you're just looking at that sentence and going, I don't know where to go from here. Go to the next one. Go to the next scene. especially if you've outlined. If you're pantsing, it's not as easy to do, but it's still doable because you know in your mind where you want the story to go. So if you get, and I do this a lot, when you get to a section and you don't know what you're going to write for the next sentence, but you're already thinking about that next scene that you want to write, but you're looking at the page going, I can't write that scene because this one's not there. You can stop that and go on to the next one. You can go and write the next chapter, or even just some dialogue in that next chapter. Because like with every great argument that I have with my wife, I don't come up with the really catchy, snappy comeback until like 2 days later in the shower. And I'm like, oh, I should have said that and I would have won. But that happens with all of my writing too, where I am struggling to come up with something for them to say or something for them to do, or figuring out how they're going to get from A to B. And instead of just sitting there and struggling, I know that intuitively it's going to come to me at some point. And so if you're just looking to get those numbers down for the words, don't focus on the words that you can't get at that particular time. Go to the next chapter and write the next chapter, because inevitably that thing that you're trying to figure out will come to you, and it will come to you while you're not thinking about it. And instead of spending half an hour trying to figure out how to say what you want to say, go to the next thing and just keep writing and get those words down, and eventually it will come.
Yeah. I have in my current work in progress that's, going to be something like 170,000 words by the time I'm done. There are like half a dozen scenes that are just cut off in the middle of a sentence because I didn't know what to write next. Like, but I do know what the next chapter is. On we go.
Yeah.
All right.
On we go.
100%. That's amazing.
I forgot to mention to Hope, thanks for joining us, even if you have to catch up a little bit. Happy to see you here. And David saying that the sharing success is not a bad thing to do. I agree. We do have from the cafe as well. I asked if anyone had any questions that they wanted before we start writing in November. We got one from Raven. And that question, I'll pop it up on screen here. Any advice in staying consistent and strong in your own writing style? Possibly better said, how not to compromise your unique voice for what is normal or expected. And then she elaborated a little bit more. Maybe better said, how on earth do you tell the difference between unique voice and bad writing? So, so however you gents want to tackle this one, the floor is open.
Go ahead, Hank.
No, I'm thinking. Wow.
I think for me, when I go ahead, guys, I'll let.
I was to phrase it. We're all just clamoring.
I know. We're all just.
I know what I want to say, but I don't want to tramp over you guys.
No, go ahead then, since you
Yes,
know
please.
what you want to say, because Doug and I are floundering.
I think the easiest way to stay consistent is don't think about it. Just write the story the way that it comes out naturally.
Yeah.
There are multiple styles of writing in terms of voice, in terms of narrative style. I jump in between. I don't have a set style of how my words come out on the page. It is influenced very much by what I'm reading at the time. So sometimes if I'm reading like a Mark Greaney book, my writing is a lot more choppy and a lot more to the point and not as colorful. If I'm reading like I'm doing right now, I'm reading Greaney and Abercrombie at the same time. So I get a really kind of mix of really kind of meandering, snarky from Abercrombie.
Snarky. Yeah.
And yeah. But honestly, I would not think too much about that while you're, especially for this challenge for sure. But it took me a long time to figure out how I wanted my voice to sound in general on the page. And I went through many iterations. And so, especially if it's your first one or even your first couple, voice is important, but it's not as important as getting the story written. And then once you figure out, like, if you want to use different words to say the same thing, that's something you can play with in terms of voice. But it's going to be very apparent if you're struggling with it, or if you're trying to maintain a specific thing that's not natural to you. It's going to be very apparent in the reading of it. So I just try to be as natural as possible in the writing, especially in the first draft. I don't really think about voice too much in the first draft. I go back and add that in later. but again, I usually don't write in first. If you're writing in first, and that voice does matter for sure. And for that, you just need to get to know the character. And a lot of times you won't know that character until you get significantly through the draft. And then you're like, okay, I really have a firm grasp on this. I can go back and add in, does he say "im" instead of "them"? You know what I mean? And then you can kind of play around with that. And that comes out a lot through the character and the writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hate to be this guy, but I think
No, you don't.
it really comes from just doing it.
Mm,
Just the more words you put on the page, the more you learn to trust that you can take these thoughts from your mind and translate them onto the page. And almost always, the first book or two that you write are going to be filtered through your influences. I know the first couple of things I wrote, I sounded like a mix between Neil Gaiman and John Grisham, because those were like two voices that I was trying to channel for different reasons. And I love them both for different. And finally, I found that my voice was somewhere, you know, uh, somewhere different. But it just came from just trying and just, you know, trusting that you can get those the ideas from your head onto the page. And there's going to be lots of false starts and stops, and it's just one of those things that just, the more you do it, the better and more confident you'll be. But try some things. If you like the way John Grisham tells a story for this type of narrative, try it. See if it fits with the way you would tell a story, and ultimately you'll feel whether if it feels fake to you or if it's a natural progression. But try it and just see, and then just do it more. And the more you do it, the more confident you'll become.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions from Shelly there that I'm going to do a screen share to answer in a sec. So hang tight, Shelly. I just want to add kind of like an amalgamation of what you guys are saying. It's if your voice will develop over time, but I think it's always going to be influenced by people that you've read and people that you are reading
Of
now.
course.
Like I know that I tend to lean a bit heavier into the details in sword fights because I read a lot of R.A. Salvatore growing up,
Mhm.
right? But then sometimes I'll go heavy into metaphors because I just finished an Adam Neville book and he, embraces Cormac McCarthy and spends like a page describing one thing.
right.
And so but then afterwards, like, it's just about getting the words down. Your voice will refine itself as you write more and more. And it's funny, in an answer to Raven's question in the cafe, we have a fellow participant, Richard, who almost said the same thing you did, Josh, is that you can fix that all in editing. You got to get
Yeah.
the story down first, whatever it is, with your voice. No one else has your voice, and then you can go back and brush it up to sound exactly how you want to make it sound. So
The only kind of counter to everything that I just said about it is sometimes voice equals style.
mhm,
And so if you're writing like a dark epic fantasy, you don't want to write it in the same voice that you might write a thriller, like a modern day
correct.
thriller, because
Yeah.
sometimes that voice can be different in the way that you use the language. Whereas dark fantasy, you may have more metaphors or more kind of flowery language in terms of description or even dialogue. Where in a modern day setting, that style isn't part of that genre, if you want to think of it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, and Hope
And
saying
that's
that you
right, you
can't
can't
edit a
edit a
blank
blank
page.
page.
It's
Mhm.
funny
Yeah.
when I went and did my co-authoring for urban fantasy, some of the feedback I got from the other author was, Doug, you're using a lot of metaphors. I'm like, well, yeah, I am, but I'm coming from a subgenre that embraces a lot more of that, like, longer, drawn out language. And we cut a bunch of them. Don't get me wrong, because the subgenre is faster paced. But I also advocated for some of them staying in there because, like, if I'm co-authoring, you are getting part of my voice, and part of my voice might be a little bit more metaphorical than, your Richard Kadris or your Jim Butchers or whomever, right? So, okay, so I'm going to answer Shelly's question here real quick. I just want to make sure that before I get to that, because that is part of the announcements that I have at the end here, homework from me. Again, not much. It is just start writing tomorrow. Tomorrow's November 1st. Start writing. Post your wins on the Storycraft Cafe. Share, how your first day went, what you're excited about, what you're looking forward to. And then tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, so same time as this started, I'm hosting a How to Succeed at NaNoWriMo workshop, because while arguably the 60-day novel challenge is the better challenge, we do have a lot of dabblers and writers doing NaNoWriMo. So it is an overlap or complementary or building on one another. So I will be sharing a lot of techniques and advice about writing 50,000 words in 30 days. So join me tomorrow for that. That's homework. That's mandatory. It's not mandatory, but I'd love seeing folks there. Or I'd love to
You've
see
been
folks there.
voluntold.
Yeah, you've been voluntold. So Shelley
Such a
asked a couple of
school
questions here. First one being, how is the word count calculated? Is it every word we write in any section of the manuscript part of the Dabble template? So I'm going to share my screen real quick. I'm actually thinking I might turn this into a little video on its own so we can share this. Okay, here's my Dabble project for the 60-day novel challenge. I'm calling it Heavenfall. You go up here. You click NaNoWriMo/challenge. I know it's a little grainy on the share screen, but it has a little trophy beside it. You click that, you're going to have two options. You're going to have the 60-day novel challenge option with the Dabble U logo, or the NaNoWriMo option. Here it says you've joined the 60-day novel challenge space, which means you've joined us on the Storycraft Cafe in that challenge space, and a check mark beside participating in the 60-day novel challenge. Odds are yours might have an X beside the 60-day novel challenge one. In that case, your button down here is going to say something like join the challenge. When you click on it, it's going to pull up the same thing as if I do this. It's going to go to your challenge settings. You're going to choose the project that you want to use for this challenge. Mine, I've titled the project The Tragedy of Nymir because I'm doing a second book afterwards. Then you go to set up goals. It's going to pull up the goal setting for this. It's going to default to a 50,000 word goal with November 30th as the end date. Really, you can just hit save changes. You're done there, but I do encourage you, if you know there are days that you can't write, go to the days off tab and choose them, right? And that will help you calculate an appropriate daily goal. If you're saying I'm not writing every Saturday, ambitious in a 30-day challenge to get 50,000 words done, but that might be your situation. You can click Saturday, it'll mark them all off for you. I'm writing every single day, or that's my goal too. So when I do this, I hit save changes. If we go here, boom, it calculates it for me. So we're at 1613 because it thinks we have 31 days left. I'm not starting till tomorrow because I'm a good Boy Scout. So it'll say 1667 when we hit tomorrow. Now, this will only calculate, like if I type here, it'll change it for the daily goal that is different than the project goal, which is what your challenge goal is tied to. But if I go here, you'll note that it's changed. Now, if I get rid of it, this goes into Shelley's second question. If I type a bunch of words, that in a accidental swear. Banned. So 2 words there. If I then delete them, I'm down to 0 words written today. All right. So deleting them will take it away. However, and let me put up Shelley's question here. If I write 2,000 words on Friday and erase 500 of them on Saturday, are they subtracted from my word count? Yes. But I encourage you, Shelley, and anyone else who has this tendency, don't erase words this month. This entire month is just about getting that 50,000 words down, using that momentum. I know the inclination or the need to go back and perfect things, but you can do that after we finish the first draft. That's what this whole challenge is about.
And let me make a recommendation. If you find yourself in the situation where you say, oh, I don't need these 500 words, they actually do damage to the story I'm trying to tell for whatever reason, create another chapter at the bottom and title it whatever, but copy those words there and paste them into that other chapter, so that it retains those words, but you've got them out of your story where it's not breaking your flow for what's coming next. That way you can maintain the words that you legitimately wrote without being penalized for editing on the fly or whatever. That's a way I would handle that.
What I normally do is, and I usually track total words typed in my daily, just everyday tracking, even if I delete. But I've got an app on Mac that allows me to track all the words that I actually type. It tracks keystrokes, not total words on the document. So I don't have to do any math, and I don't have to like keep like spreadsheets or anything like that. The app just tracks it for me. I punch in which, for instance, for this, it tracks Dabble, and it also tracks pages. Everything that I type in there, it tracks. Um, but if I'm doing a challenge like this and I get to a section where I'm trying to delete, I've done the separate chapter thing. But what I've found for me in particular is that sometimes there may be ideas or sections of those deleted things that I want, or
Mhm.
that it helps me think about that particular thing that I'm writing. So what I do, and what I have done in the past, is I just highlight everything that I don't want at that particular time and strike through it. I
Yep.
change the format to strike through, and then I just leave it, and I don't touch it, and I don't ever delete it until, well, for this I wouldn't delete it until after November.
Mhm.
But if I'm working on a chapter in, let's say, Word, and I want to track my word counts in Word, but I'm doing editing, what I'll do is I'll strike through everything that I don't want. I'll do all the writing that I need. And then, well, before I had this app, I would add up everything that I wrote that day and then delete all the strike through text. That way you still keep the written words that you already have, because it's 50,000 words written, not 50,000 words kept. And it
Yeah.
doesn't matter whether they're good or bad words. It's just writing that at that 50,000. And even if you delete them, that's still part of the process. That's still part
Yeah.
of writing your novel. Um, and for the most part, like what we've said before, it's not 30 days or 60 days to write a complete novel. It's just 60 days to write 50,000 words.
Right.
So it doesn't matter whether the words are good or not, or whether you're going to keep them at the end of November. You could write the whole thing, 50,000 words, and delete every single one of those words later, and still beat the challenge. Right. So I like doing the strike through method, just because if there's significant portions, 500 words is a lot in a chapter. I just keep that there. I put a kind of extra space between the paragraphs, line everything out, and then just keep going. And then if I ever want to like bring those words back, I don't have to remember, like if you put them in the other chapter, like you're talking about, I don't have to go back, and now you have a chapter with, 20,000 words that you've deleted, and you're like, where did these go
Right.
in the book? I don't remember the context in which I wrote these. They're still there in that chapter that you were writing.
Yeah. And you'll note, so I did this super quick. If you highlight something, there's this option here, the T with the line through it, that strikes text through. You'll note that it does not delete it from the goal. So even if you don't want it, you can strike it through. It will still count towards your goal. You can also do things like, I mean, poor example with the 4 words saying, I don't want this, but let's say you know you aren't going to use the last 2 words. You can highlight them one color, and then you can say, maybe I'm going to keep this chunk highlighted a different
Mhm.
color. So you have that
Yep.
when you go back to do your revisions. Again, I'm
100%.
going to delete
Strike
that. So
through is a beautiful thing because when I'm writing in a hurry, or trying to get a lot of words out, I use this little let me
here, let me,
remove this
yeah. Oh.
portable whoops. Dadgummit, Doug. I have
I
this
just had a
portable
seizure.
I know. I have this portable keyboard and an old phone that has been wiped, and there's nothing on this phone but Dabble, and so I'm writing on a 6-inch phone screen, and it's not good for editing. But I see about 4 lines of text at a time, and you can strike through and instead of deleting and trying to move around
Mhm.
and come back to it later, and that's
Yeah.
a genius way to handle that.
The other question Shelly had, how does the transfer of word count to the NaNoWriMo site work? So I'm going to share my screen again. 2-part answer to this. Same thing. You go here, you can authenticate with Nano, and that's going to link your NaNoWriMo account to your Dabble account. And so then when you write in Dabble, and I know this is very important for some people given what's happened in the last couple months, only your word count is reported to
Yes.
NaNoWriMo. Nothing
No
else is sent
words
to
are ever transferred to NaNoWriMo, ever.
Yeah. So you write 1,667 words that day. We'll let them know. It'll update their word counter. then you just keep going.
Yep.
Okay. Let me check my list to make sure there's nothing I'm missing here. Oh, there is one other thing I want to share before everyone takes off and before we let the world go on with what they want to do today. How do I? Sorry, I thought I downloaded it as a slide. Give me one sec here. I know Robert shared this yesterday, but
The calendar.
Not the calendar, the sneak peek.
Ah.
Yeah. Share screen and window. It's going to be in my photo app, so sorry for the ugliness, but a little sneak peek into what we're bringing this November. So the first, you have the NaNoWriMo Success Workshop with yours truly. On the 4th, Hank is chatting with someone famous about genre. On the 7th, we have a 3-hour.
I didn't get an invite for that, Hank. Who are you talking to? That's ridiculous.
On the 7th, we have a 3-hour writing marathon. On the 14th, we're talking about diving into rising action. The 19th, we have a very special workshop with author Sarah Cannon. I'm very excited for that one. On the 27th, this is going to be an exhausting one, and Josh, you're more than welcome to join us whenever you want, but we're doing an all-day writing marathon where Hank, Robert, and I will take shifts alternating every hour to cover the entire day from 9 a.m. Eastern to, I think it ends at 6 p.m. Eastern, or that will be when the last sprint is, and just all day writing. And then 30th, we have a huge gift for everyone, dabblers and non-dabblers alike, something we're very excited about. And then this big guy on the side here. Every Monday through Friday, every working day of November, we're doing writing sprints at 12:30 Eastern. The only exception being tomorrow. The writing sprints will be right after the NaNoWriMo workshop. So yeah, very exciting stuff. Lots of good stuff coming. It's going to be a very exciting month for everyone. And the only other thing that I want to mention is our next 60-day challenge show like this is on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern rather than Thursday. Both Hank and I are traveling for different things. So we tragically can't be live on Thursday, but it will be Tuesday, 2 p.m. Eastern here. But join the cafe. You'll get the notification for that. Or hit notifications on YouTube. Anything else before we go, gentlemen?
I don't. I think we're good. I think we're wound up and ready to launch tomorrow.
So excited to start
anyway.
This book.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Hank, Josh, thank you for joining me today for this awesome show. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for chatting, and for participating in the 60-Day Novel Challenge. Tomorrow we start writing. As Hank says, we write at dawn. So
yeah.
Right at dawn.
See you all tomorrow, everyone.